The stars were quiet, but the silence was not peace. It was the silence of waiting before the storm. At the far edge of the galaxy, humanity had gathered what was left of its once mighty fleet. Once there were thousands of ships that carried the banner of Earth. Now only a handful remained, scattered and broken, with their hulls scarred from endless battles. Among them was the great dreadnought Iron Will. It was the last of its kind, a warship built to withstand sieges, to stand as a wall against any enemy. The dreadnought was old now, its armor dented, its systems tired, but its spirit was unbroken. For many survivors, it was more than a ship. It was a symbol of what humans still had the will to resist, even when the universe turned against them. Captain Mara stood at the command bridge, her eyes fixed on the cold horizon of space. She was tall, with lines of exhaustion carved on her face, yet her posture was steady. She had seen worlds burn. She had seen fleets torn apart. Still, she stood unshaken. Around her, the crew moved with quiet focus. There were no jokes, no idle words. Every person knew the truth: there would be no return from this fight. The enemy was the Varnak, a race that spread like fire across the stars. They were not driven by need, but by conquest. Entire human colonies had fallen under their advance. Earth itself was lost, left as ash in their path. The last colony ships carrying civilians had already fled into the depths of space. Their only hope of survival was distance. But distance needed time, and time had to be bought. That task fell to the Iron Will and the small fleet that still followed it. Mara turned to her officers. "We stand here not for victory," she said, her voice calm yet firm. "We stand so that others may live. Every moment we hold the line gives them a chance to escape. Remember this when the battle begins." The crew did not cheer. They did not need to. Their silence was stronger than any shout. Each one had chosen to remain on the dreadnought knowing the cost. They were not bound by orders, but by choice. That choice gave them strength. The fleet drifted into formation near a region of broken asteroids, their shapes casting long shadows in the light of distant stars. The smaller ships, frigates, and corvettes, circled the Iron Will like birds guarding their parent. Their captains sent final messages of loyalty and resolve. Some spoke of their families hidden aboard the fleeing colony ships. Others simply swore that if this was their last day, they would make it one the Varnak would never forget. Inside the dreadnought, preparations began. The engineers worked tirelessly to keep the ancient engines alive. The weapon crews checked and rechecked every shell and every beam. The medics organized supplies, knowing they would soon be overwhelmed. Every hand had a task, and every task carried weight. Mara walked the decks, speaking to her crew. She placed a hand on a young technician's shoulder, steadying his trembling hands. She spoke gently to the gunners who had lost friends in the last battle, reminding them that their courage honored the fallen. She moved with calm purpose, and in her presence, fear gave way to determination. The silence of space stretched on, heavy and endless. Then the first warning signal reached the fleet. The Varnak were near. Their ships had been spotted on the outer edge of the system, moving fast and without hesitation. Dozens of signals lit up the scanners, then hundreds. The storm had arrived. The crew of the Iron Will did not falter. Stations came alive with disciplined movements. Lights blinked, engines rumbled, weapons powered up. Across the fleet, captains gave their final orders. The line had been drawn. Mara returned to the bridge, her eyes fixed on the glowing swarm approaching on the display. The Varnak ships were larger in number, heavier in firepower, and faster. But they lacked one thing. They did not understand what it meant to fight with no hope of return. The dreadnought's great cannons turned toward the darkness. Torpedoes slid into launch tubes. Shields hummed as energy poured into their frames. Every system strained to readiness. The crew braced themselves not for survival, but for defiance. Outside, the scattered asteroids drifted slowly, silent witnesses to what was about to come. Inside the iron will, hearts beat steady, hands tightened on controls, and eyes locked on their captain. Mara gave the order. Prepare to engage. We fight until the last breath. And so began the final stand of the last fleet of humanity. The vast emptiness of space pressed around the dreadnought Iron Will, yet inside its walls, the crew felt the weight of destiny. The warning of the enemy's approach had already reached every ear. Some whispered quiet prayers, others checked their tools or weapons one last time, but none left their post. They all knew what waited for them beyond the cold stars. Captain Mara stood at the center of the command bridge, calm and composed. Her gaze lingered on the fleet status glowing across the displays. The smaller frigates were in position, the corvettes were weaving between the asteroid field, and the dreadnought itself stood as the anchor of the formation. Everything was ready. Still, Mara knew that machines and weapons were not enough. What bound them together was not steel or firepower. It was will. And that will had to be kept alive. She turned slowly to face her officers and crew. The hum of machines filled the silence as all eyes fixed on her. We have all seen what the Varnak can do, she began, her voice steady, carrying across the chamber. We know their strength, their numbers, their hunger. They believe that fear will break us. They believe that we will run, scatter, and fade from the stars. But they are wrong. We may not see Earth again, but our people will carry its memory into the future. That future depends on us standing here. Her words sank deep into every heart. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Every sentence was filled with quiet certainty, the kind that grows not from pride but from conviction. She stepped closer to the front of the bridge. Behind us, the colony ships flee into the dark. They carry children who will one day tell stories of this hour. They carry farmers, builders, teachers, people who only wish to live in peace. We cannot give them safety forever, but we can give them time. Time enough to build, time enough to heal, time enough to hope. That is why we fight. Her eyes swept over her crew. She saw the young technician who had never known Earth, yet carried its flag stitched on his sleeve. She saw the hardened gunners, their hands scarred from long battles, waiting for her command. She saw the officers who had followed her through fire and loss, still standing by her side. This will not be a battle of survival, Mara said firmly. It will be a battle of meaning. Every second we endure will echo through the lives we save. That is our promise. And it is a promise I will keep with you, until the end. There was no cheer, no outcry, but something stronger filled the bridge. The air grew heavy with resolve. Some crew members nodded, others straightened at their stations. Fear did not vanish, but it was reshaped into courage. Lieutenant Wren, the chief engineer, leaned closer to his console and whispered, "Engines will hold, Captain. They'll burn with us if they have to." Pilot Darrow, seated at the navigation station, tapped the warn controls and added, "We'll make them chase us into fire if need be." Mara gave them both a short nod. Words were not wasted now. Each person had spoken enough through action. Across the ship, the message spread. Officers repeated the captain's words to their teams. On the lower decks, mechanics lifted their tools with new purpose. Medics checked their supplies and tightened their gloves. Gunners cleaned their barrels, whispering the same vow to hold until the last. The smaller ships in the fleet sent signals of acknowledgement. One by one, captains voiced their readiness across the comm channels. A frigate commander promised to shield the dreadnought with its last hull plate. A corvette pilot swore to draw enemy fire until their ship was nothing but drifting metal. The chorus of promises filled the comms, not loud, but steady, like the heartbeat of a people that refused to die quietly. Mara listened, her chest heavy yet proud. These men and women were not just soldiers. They were the last defenders of a civilization. They would not bend. Hours passed slowly as the Varnik fleet crept closer. On the scanners, their numbers grew, first dozens, then hundreds, spreading across the void like a dark wave. The sight was terrifying, but no one turned away. The Iron Will prepared its first barrage. Torpedo bays opened with a deep metallic groan. Cannons swiveled into position. Shield generators pulsed with growing energy, casting faint ripples of blue light across the hull. Mara remained on the bridge, silent now, letting the crew work. She placed her hand on the cold railing before her, as if she could feel the heartbeat of the dreadnought through the steel. She knew this ship was not alive, yet in its walls lived the spirit of all who served within it. At last, the enemy came into full view. The Varnik ships were sleek and sharp, glowing with alien energy. Their formation spread wide, surrounding the human fleet like hunters circling prey. Mara's officers looked to her. Her words earlier still burned within them, but now they needed the order to begin. She lifted her head, her voice clear and commanding. "Signal the fleet. We stand. We fight. We give them no step backward." Across the stars, human ships responded with lights flashing in unison, a final salute before fire and chaos would consume them. The last fleet of humanity was ready. The region of space called the Abyss Rift stretched before the last human fleet. It was a graveyard of broken asteroids, shattered moons, and drifting fragments of old battles. The rift had earned its name from the way it swallowed light, leaving the area darker than the space around it. Many pilots feared it, but Captain Mara saw opportunity. The rift's shadows could be used to hide traps, to confuse the enemy, to turn numbers into chaos. The Iron Will moved slowly into position at the center of the rift. Around it, the frigates spread out in tight groups, and the corvettes slipped into the shadows between floating rocks. Every ship knew its place. Every crew waited for the moment when the first enemy wave would arrive. On the scanners, the Varnik fleet swelled larger. Dozens of enemy cruisers approached first, their hulls glowing with strange symbols. Behind them came the heavier ships, sharp as blades, cutting through the void with ease. The Varnik did not fear traps. They had never known defeat. Inside the Iron Will, the atmosphere was tense but focused. Engineers worked furiously to keep the weapons charged. Gunners lined up their sights, their hands steady on the controls. On the bridge, Mara studied the incoming wave. She knew the first strike had to count. A weak beginning would only embolden the enemy. She turned to the comms officer. "Signal the fleet. Hold fire until my mark." The message was relayed, and silence filled the human channels. Moments later, the first Varnik cruisers entered the rift. Their formation was tight, arrogant, as if they believed nothing could touch them. That arrogance was exactly what Mara had hoped for. "Mark," she ordered. The void lit up with fire. From the shadows of the asteroids, hidden torpedoes launched in perfect unison. The frigates fired their broadside cannons, and the Iron Will released a thunderous blast from its main gun. The opening strike tore through the leading wave of enemy ships. One cruiser split in half instantly. Another exploded in a sphere of flames, scattering wreckage across the rift. The Varnik formation broke as their ships swerved to avoid the sudden ambush. They had expected prey, not hunters. "Reload torpedoes. Redirect power to forward shields," Mara commanded. The enemy recovered quickly. More ships poured into the rift, beams of green energy slicing through the darkness. One corvette, caught out of position, was destroyed in a single strike. Its last signal echoed across the comms, not a cry of fear but a farewell, reminding the others to hold the line. The Iron Will pushed forward, cannons roaring again and again. Each blast shook the dreadnought, but each blast also carved holes in the enemy ranks. On the lower decks, the crew felt the tremors and cheered quietly, knowing their ship still had strength left. Pilot Darrow guided the dreadnought through drifting asteroid chunks, keeping the massive ship in motion despite its size. "Bringing us closer," "Captain," he said, sweat dripping down his face as his hands moved quickly across the controls. "Steady," Mara replied. "Closer means stronger hits. Make every shot count." The battle grew fiercer as both sides pressed harder. Human frigates darted between rocks, unleashing quick bursts before hiding again. The enemy cruisers chased them, sometimes crashing into the asteroids in their haste. Explosions flared everywhere, turning the rift into a storm of fire and debris. In the heart of it all, the Iron Will held the center. Its thick armor absorbed blow after blow, its shields flashing with each strike. The gunners inside shouted as they hit their marks, and the engineers below deck fought to keep systems alive. Sparks flew, smoke filled the corridors, yet no one abandoned their post. One enemy battleship turned its weapons fully on the dreadnought, firing volley after volley. The shields of the Iron Will screamed under the strain, their blue light flickering. Mara stood firm. "Return fire. All batteries." The ship's cannons unleashed a storm, hammering the battleship again and again. At last, the alien vessel cracked, flames pouring from its hull before it collapsed into a field of wreckage. The crew of the dreadnought erupted in cheers, but Mara raised her hand. "Focus. More are coming." She was right. The scanners lit up with even greater numbers. The first wave had only been a test. Now the full strength of the Varnak pressed into the rift. Dozens upon dozens of warships closed in, their weapons shining like stars turned against humanity. "Captain," Lieutenant Wren warned from the engineering station, "shields won't hold forever. We'll burn through power at this pace." "Then we use every drop," Mara answered. "This ship was built to fight until the end. That is what it will do." The dreadnought surged forward once more, leading the charge. Human ships followed, battered but unbroken, striking with fury at every opening. The abyss rift shook with the soundless roar of war, a clash of wills written in fire across the stars. The Varnak still had numbers. They still had strength. But for the first time in their long conquests, they faced something else: humans who refused to run, humans who fought with the knowledge that survival was already lost, yet meaning could still be won. And at the center of it all, the Iron Will lived up to its name, standing like a fortress of fire against the endless night. The rift burned with the light of battle. Shattered asteroids spun wildly through the void, many of them glowing from fire and wreckage. The Varnak pressed harder, wave after wave of their ships flooding into the region. Their commanders had believed the humans would scatter after the first strike, yet the opposite had happened. The humans had stood their ground, and the dreadnought Iron Will had turned into a storm that refused to fade. On the bridge of the Varnak flagship, Commander Sarek stared at the battle screen in silence. His kind had conquered hundreds of worlds, broken countless fleets, but never before had prey fought like this. The humans did not retreat, they did not beg for mercy, and they did not crumble under fear. Instead, they struck harder with every loss. It unsettled him. "Their ships are fewer, yet they fight as if they cannot fall," one of his officers reported, unease in his voice. "It makes no sense, Commander. Why do they not flee?" Sarek's eyes narrowed. "Because they are already lost. That makes them dangerous." Back in the Iron Will, Captain Mara stood firm as the dreadnought shook from another barrage. Flames licked across one of the side corridors, quickly sealed by emergency teams. Smoke drifted in the air, but the crew did not falter. Gunners kept firing, engineers kept the power flowing, and pilots of smaller ships carried out daring maneuvers to strike at enemy cruisers. "Frigate Valor reports heavy damage," the comms officer said, voice tight. "They request permission to ram the nearest cruiser before they lose engines." Mara closed her eyes for a heartbeat, then gave her order. "Permission granted. Tell them their sacrifice will not be in vain." Moments later, across the rift, the Valor surged forward with engines blazing. It slammed into a Varnak cruiser, tearing both ships apart in a burst of fire and metal. The explosion shook the enemy formation, scattering 2 more ships off course. Cheers erupted inside the dreadnought, but they were mixed with grief. Every loss was felt, even when it bought victory. Yet as the battle raged, something new began to happen. The Varnak hesitated. Their formations grew less steady, their maneuvers less confident. Ships that once pressed forward without pause now slowed, wary of hidden traps. On the bridge, pilot Darrow noticed it first. "Captain, look at them. They're pulling back slightly, adjusting their lines. They don't know how to handle us." Mara's gaze sharpened. "They've learned fear." It was true. The Varnak had expected an easy slaughter, but what they faced was defiance stronger than numbers. Every torpedo that struck, every cannon that fired, carried the message that humans would not bow. A report came from Lieutenant Wren in engineering. "Captain, power systems are straining, but the dreadnought is still holding. The ship fights with us." Mara nodded, her voice firm. "Then we give the enemy no rest. Target their command ship." The Iron Will turned its great cannons on a larger cruiser at the center of the Varnak line. The blast struck hard, ripping through its shields and tearing its hull. The alien vessel spun helplessly before vanishing in a brilliant explosion. The sight sent a ripple of shock through the enemy fleet. Inside the Varnak flagship, Commander Sarek slammed a clawed hand against the console. "Impossible. One ship should not inflict such loss." His officer whispered, "Commander, they fight as though death itself does not matter to them." "What creature does this?" Sarek had no answer. He could only glare at the stubborn human dreadnought that refused to die. Back in the rift, the humans pressed their advantage. Frigates darted in and out of asteroid shadows, landing precise strikes. Corvettes flew reckless runs, drawing fire away from the dreadnought. The Iron Will itself fired again and again, its hull scorched but its spirit burning bright. The surprise grew heavier on the enemy with each passing moment. The Varnak had expected terror but found courage. They had expected surrender but found resolve. Yet victory had its cost. Another corvette was lost, torn apart by enemy fire. A frigate drifted powerless, its crew still firing manual weapons even as their ship died. Inside the dreadnought, medics rushed to aid the wounded, their hands trembling yet steady with purpose. Every life lost weighed heavily, but every loss carried meaning. Mara stood at the center of it all, her voice the anchor of her crew. "Hold the line. Make them feel every strike. Show them that humans do not vanish quietly." Her crew obeyed with fierce devotion. The dreadnought blazed like a beacon, its guns shaking the rift with thunder. For every human ship that fell, 2 enemy ships were shattered. For every cry of loss, a roar of defiance answered. The Varnak had wanted to crush the last of humanity quickly. Instead, they found themselves dragged into a fight that tested their will. The surprise was no longer just the humans' bravery, but the realization that one ship, one fleet, could hold back an empire through sheer refusal to yield. The battle in the rift was far from over. But in that moment, for the first time, the Varnak felt something they had never known before: doubt. And humanity, even standing on the edge of extinction, had given it to them. The rift glowed with fire. Debris from destroyed ships drifted endlessly, some pieces colliding with asteroids and breaking into smaller fragments. The battle had lasted longer than anyone expected, and both sides were bleeding strength. Yet while the Varnak still had numbers to spare, every human ship that fell could never be replaced. Inside the dreadnought Iron Will, alarms blared without pause. The great vessel had taken heavy punishment. Its shields flickered, its armor was scarred with holes, and smoke drifted through several decks. Still, the crew fought on. Each man and woman knew that every passing minute gave the colony ships farther behind them more time to escape. That was all that mattered. Lieutenant Wren wiped soot from his face as he shouted across engineering. "Reactor 3 is overheating. We need to vent power or it'll shut down." His team scrambled over the panels, their hands shaking from exhaustion but never slowing. Sparks burst from a conduit, but Rin slammed it closed with his bare hands, ignoring the burn. Keep it together. This ship does not die today. On the bridge, Mara stood firm, her uniform stained with smoke and ash. Her eyes moved from screen to screen as reports came in. Frigate Hope's Edge destroyed, Captain. Corvette Arrow crippled, crew still firing manually. Medical bays overrun with wounded. Every word was a wound, yet Mara did not falter. Her voice remained calm. Mark their names. None will be forgotten. Redirect fire to their forward cruisers. Make the enemy pay for every breath they steal. Pilot Darrow's hands bled from gripping the controls too tightly. He had flown through storms before, but never like this. Every turn risked smashing the dreadnought into drifting wreckage, yet he guided it with precision. Bringing us between the asteroid clusters, Captain. It will give us partial cover. Good, Mara said. Use the shadows. Strike when they least expect it. Outside, the Iron Will emerged from behind a massive asteroid and unleashed its cannons at close range. The blast tore through an enemy cruiser, ripping it apart in seconds. But before the crew could celebrate, the dreadnought shuddered as 3 Varnic beams slammed into its side. Armor ripped away, exposing decks to the void. Dozens of humans were lost in an instant. The crew on surviving decks felt the shock but did not break. Instead, the gunners shouted in fury as they fired again, their weapons glowing with heat. The engineers screamed orders over the roar of failing systems. Medics carried the wounded, even as explosions shook the halls around them. Rin's voice crackled over comms. Engines running hot. We'll burn out if this keeps up. Mara answered firmly, then let them burn. If the ship holds long enough to save the colony, it is worth every flame. Even in the face of loss, no one questioned her. They had chosen this path together. One frigate, heavily damaged and barely holding together, called over the comms. This is Falcon. We can't hold much longer. Permission to ram. Mara closed her eyes for a brief moment before replying. Granted. Strike true. The crew of the Falcon answered with a single word. For humanity. A moment later, their ship accelerated at full speed into a Varnic destroyer. The impact shook the rift, destroying both ships in a fiery burst. The sacrifice bought the Iron Will a few more moments of survival, but it also tore at the hearts of those who watched. On the bridge, silence fell for a heartbeat. Darrow whispered under his breath, "How many more must we lose?" Mara's voice cut through the silence. "As many as it takes." The Varnic pressed harder, frustrated that one fleet, one ship, still resisted them. More beams rained down on the Iron Will, tearing deeper into its sides. Fires spread, alarms screamed, and systems failed one by one. Yet the dreadnought kept moving, kept firing, kept fighting. Deep within the ship, Rin collapsed to his knees, coughing from smoke. His hands were black with burns, but his eyes burned with determination. Engine stable, Captain. For now. Mara's voice came back over the COMM. You've done enough for 10 men, Rin. Hold on. The rift was a storm of chaos. Human ships fought like wolves surrounded by predators, striking fast and hard even as their numbers thinned. Every act of resistance slowed the enemy, every sacrifice bought another breath for the fleeing civilians beyond the stars. But the cost grew heavier. The fleet was nearly gone. Only a handful of frigates remained, circling the dreadnought like broken shields. Inside the Iron Will, every deck bore scars. Fires burned unchecked, corridors twisted with wreckage, and bodies lay where they had fallen. Yet the living pressed forward, refusing to let despair take them. On the bridge, Mara stood tall, her voice still steady. They think we are finished. Show them we are not. Fire all remaining torpedoes. The order was carried out. The last of the torpedoes streaked into the void, striking another cluster of enemy ships. The blast shattered 2 cruisers, damaging a third. It was not enough to turn the tide, but it was enough to remind the Varnak that this fight would cost them dearly. The price of defiance was blood, fire, and loss. Yet in the darkest hour, the crew of the Iron Will discovered something greater than fear. They discovered that even in defeat, they could carve their names into the stars. The dreadnought still stood, battered and burning, but unbroken. And so the cost of defiance became its strength. The void of the Abyss Rift was a battlefield of fire and shadow. The Iron Will floated through the wreckage of human and Varnak ships alike, battered but unbroken. Fires burned on multiple decks, alarms screamed without pause, and the hull groaned under relentless strikes. Still, Captain Mara did not falter. She had guided her crew through every trial, and now the final challenge had arrived. The scanners lit up with the approach of the Varnak's heaviest battleship. It was immense, dwarfing the Iron Will in size, and its weapons glowed with destructive energy. Every pulse promised annihilation. The smaller human ships had already fallen, leaving only the dreadnought to face the alien giant. The weight of the mission pressed down on Mara. Beyond this battle lay the last colony ships, drifting through the darkness toward safety. Their lives rested on this moment. "Captain," Lieutenant Wren reported from engineering, "we can hold the engines and weapons, but only for one final push. After that, the ship will be lost." Mara's jaw tightened. "Then one push it shall be. Prepare every cannon, every torpedo, every weapon we have. We end this here." Pilot Darrow gripped the controls tightly. "Navigating the rift at this speed, Captain, the chance of collision is high. But if we close fast, we can strike at point-blank range." Mara nodded. "Then close fast. Time is life for others. We give them every chance we can." The dreadnought surged forward, moving through the maze of asteroids with precise calculations. Every second mattered. Behind the ship, the darkness was broken by trails of fire from destroyed enemy vessels. Ahead, the Varnak battleship glowed like a star turned to steel, its massive cannons aimed directly at the human ship. "Brace for impact," Mara said calmly. "This is the moment we were built for." The first exchange of fire shook the Iron Will. Enemy beams slammed into its side, tearing through armor and throwing sparks across the bridge. The hull creaked and groaned, but the dreadnought moved steadily forward. The crew fought with unmatched determination, keeping weapons running and shields holding against the overwhelming assault. "Forward torpedoes loaded," Lieutenant Wren shouted. "All batteries ready." "Then fire at my mark," Mara commanded. The dreadnought surged closer to the Varnak battleship. Both ships fired simultaneously, beams colliding in the darkness with a blinding flash. Explosions lit the Abyss Rift, sending shards of metal and fire drifting through the void. The shock waves rocked the Iron Will, but the crew stood their ground. Pilot Darrow maneuvered the ship with expert precision. "We're close enough now, Captain. Point-blank range." Mara gave the final order. "All weapons, fire together." The dreadnought unleashed everything it had. Torpedoes, cannons, and energy beams converged on the alien battleship. The impact tore through its shields, ruptured its hull, and sent fire rolling across its surface. Pieces of the enemy ship began to break apart, spinning into the void. Inside the Iron Will, the crew felt both triumph and fear. They knew the ship had taken irreversible damage. Fires raged across decks, and many systems failed. Still, the human dreadnought pressed on, moving through the debris like a force that refused to die. "Captain," a communications officer shouted, "the colony ships are responding. They've received enough time to escape further." Mara allowed herself the smallest smile. "Then our sacrifice is not in vain. Push through until the end." The Varnak battleship let out one final attempt to crush the dreadnought, firing every remaining weapon. Beams struck the human ship with terrifying force. Hull plating cracked, corridors filled with smoke, and alarms screamed. The iron will shuddered, and the crew held their ground despite the chaos. "Hold steady," Mara commanded. "This is our last stand. We fight not for survival, but for meaning." Every crew member acted with unwavering courage. Gunners fired manually when computers failed. Engineers rerouted power from damaged sections to critical systems. Medics carried the wounded, moving through smoke-filled halls. Even as the dreadnought trembled under attack, the humans fought like a single, unyielding force. Finally, the enemy ship began to break apart. Its massive form tore in half, spinning and exploding in brilliant fire across the rift. The roar of destruction was silent in space, but its effect was absolute. The Varnak fleet, witnessing the loss of their strongest ship, hesitated. Their confidence was shaken by one human dreadnought standing firm. Mara looked across the bridge, at the battered, exhausted faces of her crew. She knew the dreadnought would not survive much longer. Fires still raged, and the hull had taken irreversible damage. Yet the mission was complete. Humanity had won the time needed for the colony ships to escape. "Prepare for final report," she said quietly. "We have done what we came to do." The crew nodded, some with tears in their eyes. They had fought without hope of return, but their courage had changed the fate of countless lives. They had turned the edge of defeat into a victory measured not by survival, but by sacrifice. The Iron Will stood as a blazing symbol in the abyss rift, battered, burning, and unbroken in spirit. And humanity had proved that even when all seemed lost, courage, resolve, and defiance could strike harder than any weapon. In the darkness of space, the dreadnought's final stand would echo across the stars, a testament to the strength of a people who would never yield. The abyss rift was quiet now, though its silence was heavy with the memory of fire. Pieces of destroyed ships drifted slowly through the void, glinting faintly in the distant starlight. The human dreadnought Iron Will was no longer fully operational. Its hull was torn, fires still burned deep within, and many of the crew had fallen. Yet what remained of the ship and its people had achieved the impossible. The last colony ships had slipped beyond the rift, disappearing into the darkness toward safety. Humanity had survived, at least for now. Captain Mara stood on the bridge, leaning against the railing. Smoke drifted around her, but she breathed steadily, eyes fixed on the stars where the fleeing colony ships had vanished. She felt the weight of all who had given their lives in the battle. Engineers, pilots, medics, gunners, and officers all had fought without hesitation, knowing there would be no return. Yet their courage had preserved a future for those who would live to see it. Lieutenant Wren approached her, exhaustion etched across his face. "Engines are failing, Captain. The ship cannot hold much longer." Mara nodded. "I know. But it doesn't matter. We've done what we came to do." The crew around her moved quietly, some tending to fires, others checking on the wounded. Their movements were slower now, heavy with fatigue, yet there was no despair. The mission was complete. They had given humanity a chance to live, and in that, there was pride. Pilot Darrow entered the bridge, his uniform singed, face streaked with soot. "They're gone, Captain. The colony ships are safe. We bought them time." A faint smile touched Mara's lips. "Then our sacrifice matters. We may not see them again, but they carry our memory. They carry hope." The Iron Will creaked under the strain of battle. Systems failed one after another, leaving only basic life support and the weapons still barely functional. The ship that had once been a fortress now felt fragile, but its spirit burned brighter than ever. Mara felt that fire in herself and in the surviving crew. It was not fear, not grief, but a determination to leave a mark that could not be erased. Across the rift, the remaining Varnak fleet hesitated. Their largest battleship destroyed, their numbers weakened, and their morale shaken, they no longer pressed forward. Commander Sarek's pride had been broken by one human dreadnought and a crew who refused to yield. The Varnuk realized that humans fought not for life alone but for meaning. And that understanding, though bitter, was something they could not conquer. Mara walked the bridge slowly, placing her hands on consoles that had carried the weight of battle. She saw the faces of her crew, some injured, some exhausted, yet all alive and unbroken in spirit. Each one had chosen defiance, had chosen to fight without hope, and had helped shape the outcome of a war that had seemed certain to end in extinction. "Captain," a young technician spoke softly, "we may not survive this, but we gave them a chance. The colony ships, they will live because of us." Mara looked at him and nodded. "Yes. That is the truth we carry. That is the fire that will never die." Even as the dreadnought's hull weakened and fires spread through its lower decks, the surviving crew stood together. They knew the end of the Iron Will was near, yet they refused to abandon their posts. They continued to monitor the rift, to mark debris, and to ensure that the path for humanity's future remained clear. Outside, the stars stretched endlessly, vast and indifferent. Yet in that emptiness, the actions of a single ship and its crew shone brightly. They had fought until the last breath, and in doing so, they had proven something far greater than mere survival. They had proven the strength of humanity, the courage to face impossible odds, the will to act even when hope is gone, and the ability to inspire others by example. Finally, Mara activated the final communications log. "To anyone who finds this recording, know this: humans will not vanish quietly. Even when all seems lost, we fight. We endure. And we inspire. Let the memory of the Iron Will and its crew guide those who come after. Let it remind them that courage can turn the tide of fate itself." The log ended, leaving only the sound of distant alarms and the hum of life support. The crew gathered at the bridge, holding one another as the last fires consumed the lower decks. Each one felt a sense of peace. They had given everything, yet in doing so, they had left a legacy. The Varnuk fleet began to retreat, cautious and wary. They would remember this encounter, remember the human dreadnought that had stood against them alone. In the stories of the stars, this battle would live on, a reminder that courage is stronger than fear and defiance stronger than despair. Captain Mara looked out into the darkness one last time. The future of humanity had been secured, even at the cost of her ship. She felt a warmth in her chest, not from safety, but from pride. The fire of the Iron Will and its crew would continue in every life they had saved. The flame of defiance, of courage, of humanity itself, would never die. In the endless night of space, the memory of the last human dreadnought shone brighter than any star. It was a flame that would inspire generations, a symbol of hope that no darkness could extinguish. And so the Iron Will became legend. Humanity endured. Humanity triumphed.